Welcome, Dracuphiles, to Sundays with Dracula. Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will. This is chapter 15 of Sundays with Dracula. I'm Edward G. Pettit of The Rosenbach in Philadelphia, the home of Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula, over 100 pages of outlines, early plot ideas, and research notes compiled by the author over the 7 years he developed and wrote the book. It is an extraordinary record of the conception and development of a novel. We will see something from Stoker's notes today. And joining me today as co-hosts are Sheffield Gothic's own, although maybe only one of them is Sheffield Gothic's own right now, Mary Going and Dr. Lauren Nixon. Lauren made it in just in time.
Yes, I realized it had, for some reason, logged me in as Mary, and it was showing up as
what was going on? Yeah, I saw that.
Which is not a bad thing.
Not a bad thing.
Not helping the rumors that we are two separate people.
Yeah, you know, we have some issues with people thinking we're just one entity split into two forms. So I thought about logging in as myself.
All righty. Well, I'm glad you could both get in on your own, under your own name. Know who you are who are watching it live. It is great to see you both. I so look forward to delving into this chapter with you and talking about conditional immortality, which I hadn't known I was going to talk about until last night. So sorry for short notice on that. But because what we do here on Sundays with Dracula is illuminate, elucidate, explicate Bram Stoker's novel about bloodsuckers in the 1890s, one chapter at a time for 27 weeks. Co-hosts join me each week to create a kind of conversational annotation of the entire novel. And Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula are one of the many, 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 many gems of the Rosenbach's collections. And while we're all still in pandemic stay-at-home mode, you can go online and see some of our collection guides, as well as gallery gateways of past exhibitions and other virtual programs and courses that we are creating. The one course, Read the Blood of Dracula, starts this Tuesday that I'm teaching. We have a virtual Behind the Bookcase coming up, which I'd like to share with you. I shared it last week as well, and that is, let me share this screen with you. If you go into our webpage, you go into virtual programs, you'll see all kinds of wonderful things. Here's our Sundays with Dracula, the Drac Chat. I'll talk about all that stuff today. Where is it? Here it is, virtual Behind the Bookcase. Golden Cross, Artifacts of Spanish Imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. The Rosenbach is home to a collection of manuscripts and books from the 1500s and 1600s that record the conquest of Mexico. And in this Behind the Bookcase tour, you can study, you will get to see historic illuminated manuscripts and meet the people who populated the Spanish Empire. That is on August 21st at 12:30 in the afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time on the East Coast of the United States. So it's a really great program, and it's free, and you can register on our website. You can also just head on over to the, to give and donate any amount you want to help support the Rosenbach so I can keep doing great programs like this one. At mid-break today, I'll talk a little bit about our new after show, Monday Drac Chat, which debuted last week. We'll go again tomorrow night. One of our listeners said I should have called it Talking Undead, which would have been a much cleverer title, but I'd already called it Monday Drac Chat. So that's what it is. That's tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. EDT. And remember, if you're watching the show today live on Zoom, you can use the chat to talk amongst yourselves. As you'll see, it happens. And that's why I have a whole nother show on Monday nights now. But if you have a question for us, for Mary, Lauren, or myself, put it in the Q&A box. It's a lot easier for me to grab it. And also, if you're watching on Facebook, We broadcast live on Facebook as well. We live stream it on the Facebook, but I can't follow that one. So if you're on Facebook watching right now, I'm not going to be able to see any comments you put in on Facebook. I only do that on Zoom. And because there's new audience today, which is really nice. So I'm really looking forward to this show. Mary Lauren, what's new with you?
Hi. Well, we actually have a big announcement. So I am now officially a graduate of Sheffield University. So my PhD has been awarded. They can't take it back.
Well, they can.
Great. Well, technically they can. They can disbar me. So Mary and I have been co-organisers of Sheffield Gothic for the last 6 years. We've worked really hard to create something that would hopefully become a platform for inclusive, supportive, diverse, and enjoyable research. You know, part of the goal was not just to set up something that would help young researchers and new researchers, but that would make Gothic research fun, because it is fun. You know, we're doing the Gothic, it's not a boring subject. So, you know, we've been spending the last 6 years setting that up, and we've started projects like Reimagining the Gothic, and considering that times are what they are, we thought, you know, it seems a shame to not continue, even though we would be handing Sheffield Gothic over to some fantastic new researchers. So we have decided to launch our own multimedia digital project called the Ghoul Guides. So the Ghoul Guides is Mary and myself.
Good, I like that title. Isn't that on Vampirina too? Aren't there Ghoul Guides on Vampirina, the cartoon?
There are, yes.
Awesome.
And you know, we were just kind of spitballing names, and we just thought it was just the perfect name for something that Mary and I would be doing. So the Ghoul Guides will be hopefully a project that will grow, but we will be in the first instance launching a YouTube channel. So that will go live Friday, 6 p.m. BST, and we will be launching 2 new shows, Archive Deep Dive, which is a show in which Mary and I pick a text from the lesser known Gothic archives, and we explain the insanity to one another and try and explain the plot. And But Is It Gothic is our other show, which is a show in which Mary and I choose something, and we try and convince the other, we present a case and try and convince the other one that this thing is in fact Gothic. So this is the kind of content we'll be producing. We're hoping that it's going to be stuff that's informative, educational, that we'll be able to bring our expertise as, you know, academic researchers, but that will be engaging and it'll be fun and everybody can get involved. So, you know, we'd started our YouTube channel with Sheffield Gothic and we'd had a really good response to it. We're hoping that the new researchers will be able to use that platform when the new academic term starts, and there'll be a really nice springboard for them, because, you know, they're going to be coming into the PhD at a time where there's no conferences, there's no talks. It's going to be a really difficult time for them. So do please keep supporting Sheffield Gothic and the new people that were coming through. But Mary and I are going solo. Mary's still obviously at Sheffield, but yeah, we are rebranding ourselves.
Good.
As the Ghoul Guide. So that is our new venture.
And you're going to hand the baton off to a couple other grad students there? Is that or one or
That's
however?
the plan, yeah. So we've got some really exciting new students coming into Sheffield for the new year. And the idea had always been that Sheffield Gothic would be something that would have many iterations as a true Gothic organisation. Mm-hmm. It would rise and rise again with lots of different faces. So we're really excited to see what the new students, what the new cohort will do with it and where they'll go with it. But our project, so Reimagining the Gothic, Gaming the Gothic, will come with us. And what we're hoping to do is use Ghoul Guides to keep that alive in a time where, you know, the traditional academic landscape is not working in the way that it usually would. So we're trying to make sure that content is still accessible, that things are still happening, that new research is still being spotlighted, and that we can do what we love best, which is talk to each other about ridiculous Gothic texts.
Well, right now you are on Twitter as the Ghoul Guides, right? At the Ghoul Guides, one word, GHOUL GUIDES, the Ghoul Guides. And
Yes.
when you do your blog, when you do your YouTube channel, make sure you put it on our Facebook group,
Yes, we
our
will
Sunday
do.
Track in the Facebook group, to make sure we get, because a lot of this crowd, it follows that.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to, and I'll of course I'll even plug it on shows you're not here, of course. But I was also watching your the ones you have on the Sheffield YouTube channel, and I finally watched your interviews of each other, which I really love. And, but also to find out that Mary also really likes William Henry Ireland, and he's also a big favorite of mine. Gondes the Monk and the Abbess. I mean, I love his Gothic stuff, but of course, it's his life. It's all those Shakespeare forgeries that he. I mean, that is so fascinating. And do you know the Rosenbach has we have a really big William Henry Ireland collection. We have several volumes of his forgeries in our collection.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And it's always like, well, you never know if you have the original forgery or not, because then after he was caught, he kept making the forgeries over and over again and selling them as copies. But we have a commonplace book from him, and it is, you know, several forgeries that he did, you know, of you know, Queen Elizabeth and Shakespeare and all that stuff. But we also have a complete we have his Vortigern play that he wrote. We have a manuscript of that. I don't know if it's the manuscript. Elizabeth Fuller, our librarian's in the chat today, and she may have more about that. But it is it's so exciting. I love William Henry Ireland, and another reason why this was the greatest job in the world for me to get at the Rosenbach.
He's really great. I mean, I think what I find interesting about a lot of Gothic authors is that their lives are so interesting as well beyond their texts. And obviously, The Abbess is a really great Gothic novel, and maybe we'll get to it on Archive Deep Dive. It kind of follows the same thread as the Italian, the Monk, the Abbess, that kind of thing. But yeah, he also just came out one day and said, "Oh, look, I've discovered all of these original Shakespeare documents. Aren't I great?" And then obviously it turned out that he'd just been forging them in his attic.
I know,
which I just think is hilarious.
And when the Vortigern play got performed once, and it was a disaster, but it was, you know. But it's a great story. So people look up William Henry Ireland, and there's a couple really good bios about him that I have on my shelves as well. So that'd be a good show to do, Sundays of William Henry Ireland, and we could just go into all of his forgeries and all his works. So good. I'm glad to hear that. We'll get you over to America one of these days, and we'll put all these things in your hands that you can look at.
Yes.
We would love that. We would love to come and visit.
Good. All right. Wish I had a travel budget. I would just fly you over now, but we don't have a travel budget. So, so great. We'll get in the Dracula in a bit. I wanted to mention what I'm drinking today. Are you guys? Is it more tea? Is it going to be tea every time you're on?
It is. It's iced tea. It's very humid here at the moment,
right.
but I have it in this very professional Kylo Ren cup.
Ooh,
so
I like that. Yeah. I am drinking. This is a new drink. They're all new drinks that I come up with each time. But this is part honey whiskey. This Kinsey honey whiskey that I have, which I absolutely love. Kinsey's a Pennsylvania distillery that I really love, and it's honey whiskey and a little rye whiskey and vermouth. And then I put a little dash of that cherry hearing in it, and you can see it kind of, you know, hangs out at the bottom with the maraschino cherries. So I like the look of this drink, and then I squeeze a little lemon in it, so give you a little, you know, punch with all that sweetness in there. And I'm calling it Jack Straw's Castle. So in honor of today's chapter, where we'll hit, you know, well, Van Helsing and Seward certainly hit Jack Straw's Castle, and so this is Jack Straw's Castle. I should have called it the Spaniards, because that one still exists. We'll talk about that later. So Jack Straw's Castle today. I want to thank Bruce. Bruce is one of our audience members. Bruce is actually the programmer at the Hall of Fame, Baseball Hall of Fame Museum in Cooperstown, and he watches this show. And he reminded me today, because I didn't remember this, that today is the date that in 1956. Bela Lugosi died at age 73. So big Dracula connection, obviously. And Lugosi, as you all may know, he was actually buried in his Dracula cape and the pendant necklace that he wears in the movie. And it's actually often said that, you know, he asked to be buried, and he didn't. His son had later said that they just thought he would have liked that. So when they buried him in his cave, and you can actually find pictures of him in his coffin, which is really, you can go online, look up Bela Lugosi dead in his coffin, and there he is lying in his coffin and in the cape. And it's so weird because there are so many shots and movies of him lying in a coffin with the cape on. But there's an actual one of him truly dead, not undead, but truly dead. So today's the day Bela Lugosi died. Cheers to Bela Lugosi. Special guest coming up next week. David Scott will be on the show. He'll be joining me with Josh Hitchens. Horror theater extraordinaire Josh Hitchens will be the co-host on the show with David Scott, the author of The Untold Story, Something in the Blood, the untold story of Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula. He'll be on the show on next Sunday for Chapter 16. And then the following Sunday on August 30th, Chapter 17, Elizabeth Fuller, our librarian, will be here. And she will also share some details about 2 new vampire-themed books that the Rosenbach recently acquired. We still add to the collection all the time. I think a third of the collection has been acquired since the deaths of the Rosenbach brothers. So, I mean, the Rosenbach has always continued to collect, and Bram Stoker's Notes for Dracula were part of that later collections. It wasn't acquired until 1970. Kim Newman will be on the show next month. Sir Christopher Frayling for our final show, November 8th. And I'm still waiting for a date from Mark Gatiss. He hasn't given me a date yet, so I keep sending him emails. So sorry I'm bugging him, Mark. Like he's watching this. He's not watching the show on Sundays. I know that, but he'll be on one because he told me he would be. So I will try to hold him to that. Thanks to any new visitors joining us today. We had a little surge in registrations this week. That's why I wanted to mention. So thank you for all of you in the audience now. Thank you for spreading the word, because I'm sure some of your spreading the word led to some more people coming and tuning in today. Let's talk about Chapter 15 of Dracula. Are we ready?
We are indeed.
Good.
Yeah.
At the end of Chapter 14, we left about the bite marks on the children's necks that the Bloofer lady was making. We had that great startling line from Van Helsing, "They were made by Miss Lucy." So, of course, shocking. Seward can't put this together in his head. And it's easy to think like, you dope. Like, how many clues do you need before you can figure it out? But if you live in a logical world where supernatural things don't happen, you don't put that together. I think that's the appropriate way to approach this that Stoker has in the novel, that people aren't going to figure out it's a vampire if they don't really ever think about vampires or even know that they exist. So that slow dawning of what's going on from Seward is happening, and well, it doesn't happen. He never realized it. Van Helsing just has to out and out tell him, and his response is 2 lines into this chapter is, "Dr. Van Helsing, are you mad?" That he can't fathom this, and then Van Helsing goes and he starts to give this explanation, right, of how he's, why he's taken so much time. Why think you did I go so far around? Why take so long to tell you so simple a thing? That of course, if I just told you, you would have thought I was crazy and you wouldn't have believed anything. So I needed to take you along this process. He had to wait till the corn was ripe. That was his big metaphor earlier, several chapters ago. Wait till the corn is ripe, and then you'll be more willing to believe it. And he wished to be gentle in the breaking of the news to him. He even reminds him of that time you saved my life, which we had in, I think, the chapter when Van Helsing was introduced, and he talked about how once, was it Seward sucked the gangrene poison from his wound or something, and I don't know what that was about. So, but we don't get a backstory, which is interesting. It's one of those times that Stoker throws these little clues to a backstory, but never follows up on it. I think it was last chapter, we learned that not only is Van Helsing's wife in a madhouse, but that he's a Rochester in a sense, but he also had a son who died very young, and all things that I want to know more about, but we won't get them. So that's why there's continuing, fiction about these characters, so we can explore those things. But it continues on this line. I wish to be gentle in breaking it to you. It's hard to accept at once any abstract truth that we may doubt such to be possible when we have always believed the no of it. This kind of convoluted diction of Van Helsing. But you guys were here last week, and I kept pointing out, especially towards the end of the last chapter, of how Van Helsing isn't really a scientist. He's an occult detective. He just believes he believes everything. He believes, you name it. Yeah. If he's read it in a tabloid, he believes it's true. And it's supernatural, he believes it's true.
Yeah. He's very much in the vein as well of like Lefenu's case files. So
Dr. Hesselius, yeah.
Yeah, so Dr. Hesselius is kind of very much like a prototype of Van Helsing. And all through the 19th century, you have these kind of occult doctors or scientists. And I think having that ambiguity around Van Helsing, this is post Jane Eyre. So the fact that he has got, the wife in the asylum and the child who died young, and that he's in the vein of things like Lefenu, it adds a real tension to his character. They have to trust him because they don't have much choice. Mm-hmm. But I think as a reader, and certainly as a reader, as a fin de siècle reader, you would be anxious about him. I think there is a purposeful kind of like tense ambiguity to Van Helsing that you never really fully see behind, and that you're always not entirely sure if you can trust him as a character. Mm-hmm. There might be something strange or something untrustworthy, and there perhaps still is. But I think in terms of the way that this text builds tension and suspense, it's really cleverly drawing upon those existing Gothic tropes. I think if I was reading this, in kind of those final years of the 1800s, I would definitely be thinking, I don't trust this guy.
Yeah. I think Woman in White too. I mean, that there's and then later it'll happen again in this chapter. There's so many little images or just plot points from Woman in White that seem to appear in this. So many that it has to have been one of the texts that he was thinking about. So whether or not he was thinking of Lefenu's Dr. Hesselius is also, likely, and that he knew Lefenu's work really well.
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, Mary, I'm not sure what you think, but I think it's really safe to say that we know he's thinking of Carmilla at certain points in Dracula. So I think it's safe to say he's thinking of Hesselius and thinking of the case files and the kind of the meta text that goes with the text in Through a Glass Darkly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea of him being like a kind of occult detective. And I think you touched on it maybe last week or something when you were talking about the ideas of faith. And actually, like, what he's dealing with a different kind of faith. He's looking for concrete evidence. And I think especially in this chapter as well, you get that's what Seward needs too. He needs to believe in physical evidence. He's not, trusting on things that he doesn't have any evidence for. And I think that's what's interesting about a text like this, where you're asking someone to believe in the supernatural, but it's a different kind of faith to, I think, religious faith in a way, because here, the characters in the text, they have proof, and Seward will be shown, reams and reams and reams of proof and evidence.
In a sense, it's not supernatural any longer. It's like these creatures exist, and here's the evidence. So it's, for the unbelievers, it seems occult, and then but then you get the evidence, and it's almost as if, well, actually, he is a scientist because these things are actually happening. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Seward, especially, as well as Van Helsing, for me, in this chapter especially, he takes on a kind of doubting Thomas kind of persona, where he believes in something that is supernatural, unbelievable, but because he is shown physical evidence. So Doubting Thomas, I mean, we can talk about this when we get to the tomb, but Doubting Thomas basically was one of the 12 disciples, and he didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. And so all these people are telling him, no, we've seen him, but he just refuses to believe it, until you get that, I think it's in John, that moment where, he meets Jesus, and Jesus is like, hello, here's the wound in my side, put your hand here. And it's actually kind of a gross image, but that kind of physicality and touching that wound is what makes him believe. But there's a difference between Doubting Thomas's belief and the faith of the other disciples.
And it might be an Acts, in Acts of the Apostles. I'm not quite sure. Is it in John that occurs? That's interesting that it's in John for me. Knowing what that gospel is like and about. But anyway,
yeah, I think it's in one of the gospels. Yeah. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's in one of the other books. But it's definitely a story, like a biblical story associated with that kind of resurrection.
And we'll get even more of his doubt before the tomb, in his next, diary entry too. But also the idea that Van Helsing is this, is putting himself as a kind of, spiritual leader. He's, some kind of religious figure. It's in his language. It's in, the things that he talks about, and the way he tries to get everyone to follow him and to believe the truth. The capital T truth is what Van Helsing is preaching. And tonight he says, tonight I go to prove it. Dare you come with me? Daring him. I double dare you to come with me, Jack Seward. And of course he will, because he was dared. So why wouldn't you? I mean, if you're going to dare me, I'm going to go. This staggered me. A man does not like to prove such a truth. And then, hey, Byron sighting, another Byron sighting. How in last chapter I was very excited about. A man does not like to prove such a truth. Byron accepted from the category jealousy, and then the quote, which is a misquote, and proved the very truth he most abhorred. And what I love about this bit of Byron that he has pulled out, do you know where this is from? This is from Don Juan. Which is a comic, long comic poem, which is really funny and still so worth reading, and there's the greatest rhymes in it. Byron was absolutely brilliant at pulling these great rhymes out of his hat. And it's one of the great things about Byron too, as a romantic poet, is that he's the only one of them who was funny. None of they're all deadly serious, and Byron has no problem putting jokes in his poems. But Don Juan is a long comic poem, and in this scene, it is Don Alfonso has burst into his wife's room because he thinks he's going to find her in bed with Don Juan. And the stanza is, I can't tell how or why or what suspicion could enter into Don Alfonso's head. But for a cavalier of his condition, it surely was exceedingly ill-bred, without a word of previous admonition, to hold a levee round his lady's bed, and summon lackeys armed with fire and sword, to prove himself the thing he most abhorred. Which is, he brings all these people in to prove that she's having an adulterous affair with Don Juan, and he abhorred, that's the thing that he most abhorred. So it's a slight misquote. It's to prove himself the thing he most abhorred. And in the text, it's what, and prove the very truth he most abhorred. I love that about so many Victorian authors, constant epigraphs and quotes off of their text. And so many times they're a little bit off, which is almost proof that they're not copying out of a book. Like, this is in their heads. I could never carry those many verses of poems and lines from books in my head that they could just throw out all the time. And I keep saying Don Juan because I know that's how it's pronounced, and it's rhymed that way in the poem too. And it's not, from what I know, and see, this is what I'm asking you guys to correct me on this if I'm wrong. From what I know, it's not Byron being funny by pronouncing his name Don Juan instead of Don Juan. That is the way the British pronounced it.
I think it was just to fit with the rhyme. I think that was all it was.
Rhyme.
It wasn't a joke, but it was just that it fitted
Yeah.
with the rhyme that he wanted to do in that poem.
Yeah.
So
Let's don't say Don Juan.
it is pronounced.
No.
Yeah. No. It's
some do, but it's not not like a thing. Like, it's not that, you know, it's not like how we force, you know, name. It's not like, you know, oh, this place is called Herath, we're going to call it Sherry, because we can't say that.
Oh, Brits are crazy in pronunciation.
Which is a thing that Brits did consistently. Oh, you call it this, we're not going to call it that. But no, it's to force the rhyme. It's to make it work, because Juan doesn't work with most things.
My point is I wonder if at the time people did pronounce it Juan in England and not Juan, but also because I'm pretty certain that, especially at that time, it was Don Quixote, and people then in the 18th, 19th century didn't say Quixote.
No, Quixote was Quixote. So like it was the female Quixote. It was Quixote later. Britain and Spain still have quite a contentious relationship at this point in time. So it is entirely possible Byron's relationship with Spain and Byron's travels through Spain. So it's someone says, how do you say it's Worcestershire? Worcestershire. If you have, you know, it's Leicester, Worcester, Bicester.
My favorite is, and for everyone watching, the word is spelled Cholmondeley, Cholmondeley. There's several syllables there, but for the British, it's just, you guys know it. It's Chumley.
Chumley.
So yeah, just Chumley. So
Jane Austen's art was a Chumley.
Yeah, if we can drop any syllables that we can drop, let's just drop them. And
well, yeah, the mixture of like Huguenot and just all of the weird things that we say. I'm from Nottingham, so I actually live very, very close to Newstead Abbey, which was Byron's somewhat home. And there's some fantastic place names around there. But yeah, it's possible that the Juan thing is a little bit of a dig, potentially. But yeah, it's mostly to fit with the rhyme, and as far as I know, and as far as I can tell, Spanish pronunciation was mostly widely known amongst the upper classes, because there's still quite a strong. Spain is strange at that point in time. It's not as wild and vivacious as Italy, but it's not the same as France. You get it like in Udolpho, they get to the mountains of Spain and they kind of look down and they're like, Spain, strange place, let's not go there, and they kind of turn back. So there is a bit of an odd relationship there with Spain. But yeah, Juan is just a forced rhyme, which was very frustrating to me as an 18-year-old who studied Spanish and English literature and could not force my brain to read it as Juan. So every time I read it, I was like, well, that doesn't rhyme.
And you need the beat, even if it's not the end rhyme. You still need the extra syllable in the line. So back to the text. The as if anybody but me took me away from it. He's like the last chapter when he quotes Byron. At least it's a poem about death, and there's a vampire mentioned in it and all. This is a comic poem about sexual adventures. You know, I mean, it's about adultery. When Van Helsing says, "Let's go see," you know, I'm going to prove to you, you know, something about Lucy. Seward's head goes right to jealousy, and that, like, a quote about catching an adulteress in bed is where Seward's mind goes, or where Stoker, the author, goes as well. What do you guys think about that?
I mean, it's setting Lucy up as a kind of, you know, erotic sexual object, even in death, and you know, it makes her kind of nighttime adventures even more sinful, because she's not only a vampire, but she's cheating on all of her lovers.
Yeah, it's not about
Yeah.
her death so
No.
much. It's about some kind of betrayal on her part, right?
And it's taking it back to her physicality and the physicality of her form. You know, it's kind of ambivalent about what's going on here from a spiritual, moral sense, but Lucy, the physical being, is now Lucy, almost a purely sexual being in the act of the vampirism. It's kind of darkly, twistedly funny, because in a sort of repressed, restrictive way, that is what's happening, and that's what's going to have to happen. And I do think it's really fitting, in a sort of twisted, dare I say, perverse way.
Well, that's just a hint. So we'll absolutely get into that further once they break into the tomb. But for now, it's already there. It's already in Seward's mind that this is the issue going on here. And then Van Helsing. Van Helsing promises not to be cryptic anymore at first, which doesn't happen yet. But because he says the logic is simple, no madman's logic this time, jumping from tussock to tussock in a misty bog. I love that. That's a great metaphor. The way he's trying to explain things to Seward, it's this misty bog, and he just keeps jumping from little hill to little hill to show him something else. And he says, I'm not going to do that anymore. And then he tells him, and then we spend the night, you and I, in the churchyard where Lucy lies, which, my heart sank within me, Seward says, that he can't believe he has to go through with this. And he'll have more graver doubts about Van Helsing in his next entry. But first, they need to go visit the latest victim of the Bloofer lady. And they found the child and its throat, and the doctor there took the bandage from its throat and showed us the punctures, and there was no mistaking the similarity to those which had been on Lucy's throat. They were smaller and the edges looked fresher, that was all. We asked Vincent to what he attributed them, and he replied that it must have been a bite of some animal, perhaps a rat. And that's a clue, because we'll later see with Lucy's teeth and how they're sharp, that this is perhaps a different kind of bite than what we're accustomed to in vampire stories. But for his own part, he was inclined to think that it was one of the bats, which are so numerous on the northern heights of London. And maybe one got loose, one be bred there from a vampire, and he means a vampire bat. He also talks about the wolf that got out, how Berserker got out, which I love. A little Berserker sighting again, and then this great little story here. For a week after, the children were playing nothing but Red Riding Hood on the heath. This is when the wolf was around, and in every alley in the place, until this Bloofer lady scare came along. Since then, it has been quite a gala time with them. Even this poor little mite, when he woke up today, asked the nurse if he might go away. When she asked him why he wanted to go, he said he wanted to play with the Bloofer lady. And I love this little detail about a dangerous situation and children's games, because this is something that happens throughout, the history of children's games, isn't it? Do you have any insight on this?
I mean, in terms of particularly British kind of nursery rhymes and children's tales, you've got things like Ring a Ring a Rosie. So you do have, and Oranges and Lemons. So there is like a long-standing tradition of kids kind of performing these usually quite horrific acts and not really knowing where it comes from. So this is kind of twisting it, because they do have, actually the kids have kind of almost more knowledge than the adults do here. But yeah, the two that kind of spring to mind is Ring a Ring a Rosie, which is about the Black Death. So it's kind of Ring a Ring a Rosie is you kind of spin around in a circle holding hands. The lyrics are about things like flower petals, and then at the end you all fall down, which is everybody dying. And Oranges and Lemons is about beheading. And you
That's
stand.
not what we really know in America. What's the orange and lemons for everyone there? Do you know that little rhyme?
Looks like some people do.
Oh, do they?
Yeah. So oranges and lemons are the bells of St. Clements. You must have had that one down south as well, Mary.
Yeah.
So you kind of hold two kids hold hands and you form like a triangle. You have to run underneath. And if you're the unlucky one that gets the final blow, then you get your head chopped off. And there's quite a few. There's lots related to things like bonfire night and Guy Fawkes. There's also regional ones, so different areas have different games, different rhymes, different stories. So it's a really long-standing. I suppose really it's an extension of folklore.
I was just saying that it's a way to develop folklore, and it's one of the ways folklore kind of continues down the line, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But it's one of those things that you don't, as a child, you definitely don't know where it's coming from, and then I think you get to adulthood and realize that all of these cute playground games you've been playing actually have horrendous origins.
But even with oranges and lemons with the head chopped off again, children aren't scared by that generally. It's it is the children are even in the past when so many more children used to die. It seems as if that's not that scary a thing if we're willing to just have games and play about it, or that's a way of them dealing with it. In a sense too, could be.
Yeah, this kind of section in with the children and the way that they're kind of, obviously there's an element of mesmerism here, but the children's kind of obsession with the blue lady, I think reads very realistically.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder if this is the kind of beginning of the creepy Gothic child. I mean, there's a lot of Gothic children in 19th century literature, but this kind of having the monster originate as a whisper amongst children, and the children are obsessed with her. This becomes a massive thing in 20th century Gothic.
Yeah.
That you have the creepy child, and the child as herald, and the child, being the herald of the terrible thing that's to come. And I think what Stoker does here in creating that, and it's horror really, with the innocence of children and things like that. I think it sets up a lot of 20th century Gothic really, really well.
That's interesting. I never really thought of when that creepy child thing starts in horror, but I don't think it's in the 19th century, is it? I think they're still too involved in creating the child. It's this perfect little angel being, that's just come into play.
Yeah, you have plenty of creepy children, but they're not necessarily intentionally creepy children.
Yeah. Like old dolls are always creepy, but
yeah,
they weren't at the time. The little kids loved them. So
yeah, and I do think that the 20th century's obsession with the child as the uncanny, unsettling herald of terror or horror, has some origins here. I wouldn't want to say it starts here as a definitive, but I think this is certainly a real kind of point that I would say this is where a lot of people are thinking back to, that you've got these educated, scientific men, these modern men, and then you've got these children talking about the blue lady, and the kind of the way that horror unravels as it's revealed is quite chilling, really. I think it's really one of the kind of best.
Adam comments in our Q&A here that the Duelitists, Stoker short story, has the most intentionally evil children you could ever imagine. He mentioned this on the Facebook group too, and I haven't read. I read Stoker short fiction a long time ago, and I keep meaning to go back to this one. But the Duelitists, do you guys are you familiar with that? Because I'm not, and now I have to go back because now there's evil children in it, and I need to go experience evil children from Stoker. Steve also asked, why is the child often referred to as it, and not by a kind of gender-specific pronoun? It seems so callous to us in the 20th century, but I've always found that children were it was just the way you referred to a child, that it may have been, in a sense, some kind of callousness on the part of adults to refer to children as it, and that they don't have any kind of personhood yet, but it was also just very common practice, wasn't it?
Yeah, children. So coming out of the 18th century, you have late 18th century, you have a lot of educational tracts. So you have things like Rousseau and this reconsideration of childhood and when individuality starts. And I think what's really important to remember is that individuality as a concept doesn't really become a thing until the Enlightenment. So it's not until the early 1700s that we're even really thinking about individual beings and not as all as kind of one big homogenous people. So individuality is still kind of a new concept. Towards the end of the 18th century, as you're getting more and more in education, you're starting to think about children and the development of children, and you have a lot of kind of, you know, well, how does a child become an adult? When does the person become a person? And for the most part, you have this kind of point of change. And in girls, it's usually the obvious signs of puberty, so menstruation, secondary sex characteristics. In boys, it's kind of tied to education, and you have the breaching.
Yeah.
So when boys would go from their childhood clothes to their breeches, and that was usually when you was to be sent off to school.
Yeah.
If you look at kind of 18th century and early 19th century art, most children are androgynous until about 10 or 11. There's not a clear distinction, particularly in early childhood, between male and female.
Yeah, throughout the 19th century, whenever you see a photograph,
so all children wear
a
very
young
similar,
boy, it looks like it's in the dress. Like you can't tell by the clothes.
100%. So the breaching literally was you were given your trousers. So you were placed in trousers, and there's these fantastic like art prints and cartoons of boys being like screaming and crying because they have to start wearing trousers and going to school, and you know, they're like, no, I want to be a child forever. But I think it is tied up to this, you know, these are young children, these are pre-pubescent children. And it's kind of tied to this concept that the child is this sort of amorphous being until it hits a certain point, and then it becomes a person, and then it becomes an individual.
Mm-hmm.
So that it is, I think, less about callousness and more about this idea of the flexibility and the malleability of childhood. And certainly, yes, this is end of the 19th century, and children as a concept is changing radically.
It has changed over those 100 years.
Yeah, you know, changed absolutely radically, particularly from when, you know, these educational ideas are being first presented in the 18th century. But you do still have this kind of concept that children, particularly before the age of 12, are children, and they're almost interchangeable. You know, there's not a lot of individuality in terms of person. And puberty is kind of presented sometimes as this, it's not just a physical change, it's a sort of spiritual, mental, psychological awakening. So that it, I think, is less about, you know, oh, it's an it doesn't matter, and more that kind of like malleability and flexibility of the child as a figure.
Although, of course, for many adults, no, the children don't matter. They are, you know,
I mean, there is that too. Yeah, you have a lot of that kind of
that there. Yeah.
Yeah, until a child can sit at a table and have good manners in a conversation,
they have no agency. They have no, you know, they have no power. So.
Yeah, basically.
And women are treated that way too. So it's, you know, it is. Yes. There's a whole. It's a lot of people are treated with no agency when you look at 19th century. Someone also mentioned end of the Henry James's Turn of the Screw for a creepy child. So it's very end of the Victorian age, and right away I started thinking M.R. James's ghost stories. We have a couple creepy children.
Yeah, M.R. James, very much so.
That's end of the age. It doesn't seem to happen earlier. So I'd love to find an intentionally creepy child like mid-Victorian period.
Yeah, Algernon Blackwood. I can't remember the name of the story, but the one with the tree, and the child who finds
a
tree outside, and it's potentially demonic. But there's Fin de Siècle. There's a lot of this kind of developing uncanniness and uneasiness in the familiarity or the supposed innocence of children.
That's where it starts to seem to happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Van Helsing. Of course, because he's, you know, careful. He's never careful. I hope, said Van Helsing, that when you are sending the child home, you will caution its parents to keep strict watch over it. And, you know, the doctor assures him he's not going home yet, don't worry, or it's not going home yet, don't worry. But, you know, that's not much of a preventative. So Van Helsing again, but he never, and he'll have this later. He doesn't seem to be concerned with the victims so much as Lucy the vampire. Like, that's his goal. But at least he gives some kind of warning, which is nice. And then they head out to the graveyard. And he says there's no hurry. It's more late. There is no hurry. It is more late than I thought. That it's fine. That he just has to get to the graveyard after dark. And then they go and they dine at Jack Straw's castle. Have you guys seen this? Because this building is still, well, it's not the same building, but there's another building there called Jack Straw's castle, and that I think I have a picture. This was kind of like a famous pub then. Here it is. Let me share this because I found this really cool shot of it here from it's late 19th or early 20th century. You see the Jack Straw's castle here. Can make it a little bit bigger. Might blur a little. No, it looks nice. Jack Straw's castle. Teas as well, so you guys could have your tea there. That would be nice. But this is what it looked like, and it was the Castle Hotel, and then Jack Straw's Castle. It was a well-known pub at Hampstead at the time, and we'll see another one as well. It is, and it's also it was bombed out in the war, and now it's kind of been rebuilt, and I think it's condos, but it says Jack Straw's Castle on it still, the new building. So that's my drink today, Jack Straw's Castle. There you go.
Mary's a lot more familiar with London than I am because she is an Essex girl.
Well, we're about to hit there. So now the cemetery that they are going to. He says, well, there's a little crowd of bicyclists. I like that little hint of modernism too, because the bicycle had become so popular in the 1880s and especially the 1890s when they kind of really developed the chain bike and the wheels are the same size and everybody had them. So it's a nice little marker of it, that you would have seen a large crowd of or a little crowd or a crowd of bicyclists at all these places around there. But he says about 10 o'clock, we started from the inn. So they were there for a few hours, I think, having a few drinks, a few pints. About 10 o'clock, we started from the inn. It was then very dark, and the scattered lamps made the darkness greater when we were outside their individual radius. And then at one point, they go over the wall of a churchyard, and they find the Westenra tomb. And this is all in the Hampstead area, and finding which cemetery or churchyard, because it seems to be a churchyard here. But also it seems like it's maybe a cemetery. There's various contending sites for it. It could be a lot of people think it's Highgate, and I think Stoker has in his mind Highgate, but there's also St. John's Churchyard around there, St. Michael's Churchyard. I think if you put all the clues in the text all through here, this scene and the next scene, that any particular one you wind up with, there's some issues that it doesn't quite work, that it's that one. So for me, it seems like Stoker had this rough idea in his mind that he certainly wants to set it in this Hampstead area, and in a cemetery or churchyard around there. There's a few options. And I also think of Wilkie Collins again, Woman in White. That's the famous revelation when the woman in white is run into by whose name I can't remember, the hero of the of the story, when he first encounters the woman in white is in a lane on the Hampstead Heath. But Mary, you're familiar with this area?
Not specifically this area, more the Essexy parts or the East End parts of London. So this Hampstead is kind of like North London, kind of near Camden. So it's kind of a little bit, and I think in the 19th century it would have been like a little bit more posh, upper class. like the kind of the East End parts that I think we get in like earlier chapters, and definitely the kind of Essex parts. But yeah, I mean, I think your idea about the cemetery being a kind of a mix of different, a fictional mix of different cemeteries is probably right. It doesn't seem to fit with any, but obviously Highgate is one of the really, like, I think it's one of the seven magnificent cemeteries of London. And it is really beautiful to go and visit. Karl Marx is buried there, and also so is, I think, Christina Rossetti, and George Eliot, I think, is also buried in Highgate. So just possibly, but there's lots of really interesting people buried in Highgate, and also it's just a really beautiful cemetery. So if, like me, you like doing cemetery tours, Highgate is a really good one. And I think it's best to go with a guided tour, so you get some of that the local stories and stuff like that.
And this is go ahead, Lauren. We're going to say
Hampstead Heath itself has a sort of varied reputation, shall we say. It's always been somewhere that's kind of slightly risque. You hear a lot of stories about things happening on Hampstead Heath and encounters on Hampstead Heath. So it has this kind of, Hampstead Heath itself has this very sort of like, I don't know the exact word. It's not necessarily, Hampstead Heath is haunted, or Hampstead Heath is where all these terrible goings on happen, but it has a very sort of, it's almost infamous. Hampstead is known by everybody for
the audience. If you don't know where it is, at the time, it's still kind of on the outskirts. It is, it's big city London, and this is kind of to the north, center. If you look at a picture of London now, and it's quite expansive. Something like 700, 800 acres of mostly, kind of countryside that things are gradually being built on and put there. And so it is a place where it's designed for you and kept so people could go and have this little countryside outside of the city. So this little rural area, in a sense. And things do happen there, like you meet the woman in white there. And there's a reason why Wilkie Collins sets that scene there, is because this is a place where a creepy thing could happen. But it's also the Highgate Cemetery, especially. This is the development of cemeteries in the 19th century, when everybody in Europe realizes, and England, oh my God, our churchyards are full. Like every time we bury somebody, we have to like press down everybody underneath, and it's really disgusting. And some churchyards are leaking into the water supply, and it's really awful.
Well, they're about to crumble. There's a cemetery in Nottingham called the Rock Cemetery. Nottingham is on sandstone. So it's actually a city of caves. So the original Saxon settlement was in the cliffside, carved in, and then the Norman settlement's on top. And there's a cemetery that essentially can't have anything else on it because it will collapse in, because there's so many people buried and so many mausoleums that the amount, if they dig any deeper or they put anything else on, it's all just going to collapse inwards, because they built it on top of these kind of, old carved out, I don't know if they're burial sites originally, but you have this kind of everywhere that it's like, well, if we dig any deeper or we put any more weight or bodies, the whole thing's just going to collapse in, and there's just going to be broken tombs and remains and who knows what. So you do have this at this point in time, people are really, really worried about burial sites. There's a lot of fear.
I mean, it's harder than that. I mean, it's mid, it's a little before mid-century. They start developing these cemeteries, which tend to be rural areas just outside of and it's the urban areas that are mostly worried about it. And they start developing these cemeteries where it is, it's also kind of a place for people to visit. They think like we would think, just like park area. And so there's landscape, but also because the cemetery, you get all these monuments that you can go and look at. And some of them are quite beautiful. And it is very much a thing in the 19th century for people to spend their Sundays picnicking in cemeteries, because they're the kind of in some ways they're the parks for the 19th century city dwellers.
And they often are next to parks. They're often built into and often man-made, you know, inner city forest areas and things like that. But quite often they are specifically leisure areas, and they are next to parks, or they're next to lakes, or they're next to walks. You know, it's a very intentional leisure activity, which is why mausoleums were so popular.
And it's becoming popular again. There's a great cemetery in Philadelphia, Laurel Hill Cemetery, which it's just on this like kind of bluff that overlooks the Schuylkill River, and it was founded in the 1830s in Philadelphia. And it was the site. It was a place where people just went and frequented, you know, throughout the 19th century, and enjoyed the park, and that's returned. People, since they've been kind of redeveloping or fixing that cemetery over the last couple decades, and especially now in our, you know, pandemic times, they were packed. People were going there like every weekend in the spring, so much so that I didn't go, like, because I don't want to go out in crowds. But the irony of, you know, going to a cemetery and catching COVID, to me, is like something it's never going to happen. But I've seen a return to that. And actually there's a cemetery near our home, where that's where my wife and kids go. That's where we go to walk and to roller skate. They went roller skating there last weekend. And it is, I see that returning in a sense, that enjoying that time. So right before we visit the tomb, though, I want to take, I'll use this as our mid-break. Not that the show is ever just 2 hours, but I do try to have it to be 2 hours. So for our mid-break today, I want to remind everybody that you can join the Dracula Club, and for just $30, receive the full benefits of the Rosenbach. It is membership for an entire year. You get exclusive member access to new programs like Monday Drac Chat, which I'll talk about in a second. You get 50% off any other Rosenbach programs that we charge for, including Dracula on Film with David Scahl, which will happen next week, I think. Yes, next week. And 10% off any Rosenbach reading courses, including Read the Blood of Dracula. But you also get, most especially, the undying satisfaction of helping support the home of Stoker's Notes for Dracula. And you can say, I'm in the Dracula Club. Tomorrow night, please, everyone, tune in for our episode of Monday Drac Chat, or Talking Undead, maybe we'll call it, at 6:30 p.m. on the East Coast of the U.S. The show lasts for just an hour. Last week's show was an hour, and I couldn't believe what an hour is like. It is like I open my mouth and it's over. Each week, one of our Dracufile audience members will join me to talk about all the fabulous ideas and topics that you guys are raising today in the chat on this Sunday show. And we'll also get to know about some of our audience members' Dracula obsessions. So tomorrow's Dracufile joining me, she's also in the chat today, will be Rachel Amen. So I'm very excited to have Rachel on. I look forward to adding even more Dracula talk to my life with Rachel, and I hope you all watch as well. Our first episode with Lee Price was last week. It went very well. We also have a new song from Tucker Christine's Pleated Gazelle, and it's called Ritual in the Blood Room. So we have a new opening and closing song for the show, which is really great. Remember to watch Monday, to watch Monday Drac Chat. You need to register for the Zoom link. Somebody asked me the question, do I need to register each time? No. Once you register, you're good for all of them. If you go to our website, and you can see all the interesting things you can do with the Dracula Club. Here it is, the Dracula Club, the members only Drac Chat. If you click on that, it takes you to the registration page for that. It is for Rosenbach members. If you're a current Rosenbach member already, or if you're a new Dracula Club member, you can register for this. Also, there is the Dracula on Film program coming up with David Scahl. He will not only be my special guest next week on Sundays with Dracula, but he's also coming back on Friday, August 28th at 6:30, and we're going to talk about Dracula film adaptations. I cannot wait for that. So for Monday Drac Chat, remember that you need to register. The same link is always there. You should get you should have gotten a reminder of it today. If you're already registered, you would have gotten a reminder today, or you'll get a reminder later at 6:30 because it's 24 hours ahead of time. You get a reminder out with the link again. There's no Facebook live stream for this, and I don't post it online afterwards. The only way to watch it is 6:30 Eastern Daylight Time, live on Zoom because you registered. What else did I want to say? You are for the Dracula on Film with David Scott. If you're a Dracula Club member, you get 50% off the registration price. For the general public, it's a $15 program. Well worth it to have David Scott talking about vampire films. He's the author of The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror. He's the author of Hollywood Gothic, The Tangled Web of Dracula, from novel to stage to screen. And he has a brand new book coming out for Turner Classic Movies called Fright Favorites, 31 Movies to Haunt Your Halloween and Beyond. I'm going to use that as a guide for my October this year and just watch all of those movies every day throughout October. So join Dracula Club. You get lots for it. And I want to give a big thank you to our newest Dracula Club members. I announced all the members last week, so I'll always update this every week. And that is Christy in PA. And Christy was actually gift membership. One of our other members actually bought Christy a gift membership. You can do that. You can buy someone a Dracula Club gift membership. That is a great thing to do. There's also Natalie in PA, Brianna in PA, Lynn in New Jersey, Elizabeth in Tennessee, Charles in Missouri, Jennifer in Atlanta, and Barbara, James, Adam, Laura, Jack, and Heidi, all here in Philadelphia, PA. Thank you all for joining the Dracula Club. Back to the chapter. Why don't we have someone else read? Mary, would you like to read a little?
Yeah, of course.
I like this time. They've come into the Westenra tomb and they open it up. And then there's a sentence, the tomb in the daytime, and then on to that paragraph. Actually, you can go 2 paragraphs.
2 paragraphs, okay.
Starting with the tomb in the daytime.
The tomb in the daytime, and when wreathed with fresh flowers, had looked grim and gruesome enough. But now, some days afterwards, when the flowers hung lank and dead, their whites turning to rust, and their greens to browns, when the spider and the beetle had resumed their accustomed dominance, when time discoloured stone and dust-encrusted mortar and rusty, dank iron and tarnished brass and clouded silver plating gave back the feeble glimmer of a candle, the effect was more miserable and sordid than could have been imagined. It conveyed irresistibly the idea that life, animal life, was not the only thing which could pass away. Van Helsing went about his work systemically, holding his candle so that he could read the coffin plates, and so holding it that the sperm dropped in white patches which congealed as they touched the metal. He made assurance of Lucy's coffin. Another touch in his bag, and he took out a turn screw.
All righty. I made you read the sperm part. I was like, all right, that was there, and I didn't. But, I think that's one of those words that carries more sexual connotations for us than Victorians. I was trying to research all these Victorian uses of the word sperm. I can only find references to sperm whales. Like I can't find anybody even referring to it as as a synonym for semen. And I just don't. So what he means is the candle itself, if you don't know, is made from whale oil from the sperm whale. Spermaceti itself, see, there is a connection because spermaceti was named because it looked like semen. And sperm and spermaceti become such ubiquitous terms for candles, for wax, that it's more likely that by the end of the 19th century, I don't think people even recognize that sperm also means semen, doesn't it? So that's how prevalent it is.
I mean, I've just seen someone say, did they even talk about it at this point in time? Yes, the Victorians were obsessed with porn. for one thing. But also, now this, I might be quoting hearsay, but I'm relatively certain that semen was discovered in the early 18th century, because one of the inventors, or the inventor, I think there was multiple versions of the microscope, one of the first things that they did when they made the microscope was to look at their own semen, and that was how we discovered sperm existed. So there was a real obsession, both scientifically speaking, because how, why, what was the purpose of this, but also from a sort of sexual and pornographic, the misconception that the Victorians were very repressed. There's some great, Fern Riddle's done some really fantastic work on the history of Victorian sexuality. But no, it's actually something that was being discussed in quite detail, particularly because around about the end of the 19th century, there's a lot of scientific advancements, and people were actually really interested in how and why ejaculation existed. It's tied in, there's a lot of anxiety about things like masturbation, particularly with the vampire. There's lots of things about the high forehead. So Dracula having the high forehead, a lot of Dracula's physical description links very heavily to descriptions of, oh, well, if you engage too much in self-pleasure, these terrible things are going to happen to you, and if you're too inbred, these things are going to happen to you. So Dracula actually has some of those physical characteristics that kind of imply that too. So it's very possible this is a double entendre, but spermaceti and sperm as a term is not used to mean semen. So yes, there's a lot of discussion going on at this point in time, and people would definitely be aware of it. Would sperm be considered a double, to have a double meaning? Probably not, because it's not yet synonymous in popular vernacular. But yeah, the microscope, shockingly, one of the first things that they did was to look at their own ejaculation, and that's how we discovered sperm. Because that's how humans work.
Someone in chat mentioned probably why they invented the microscope. So
I wouldn't be surprised.
Do that. So, but Mary, when you're reading there, that there's it's all this Gothic language too, isn't it?
It's incredibly Gothic, and I mean what I read, that most of that was one sentence of things being piled onto each other. And then you have the final sentence that conveyed irresistibly the idea that animal life was not the only thing which could pass away. But yeah, you have all these kind of death images, the kind of decaying flowers, which obviously would have been white because possibly lilies, but connoting death and purity. The spiders, the beetles, all of the kind of the crusty parts of the crypt. The iron and the brass and everything that's rusted, so it's not pristine. It's slightly old and weathered, and yeah, just quite a dank, gloomy, gloomsy to use Horace Walpole. Yeah, that idea of it just not being a very welcoming or inviting environment, and I guess just conveying death. There is nothing here that is alive, which I guess then leaves the two options: dead and or undead. Very, very, very Gothic and very gloomy.
Got a lot of scents here as well. It looks rusty, it feels damp, the flowers are lank. If there is lilies, like Mary said, they smell horrendous after they've started to rot. So that horrible, sweet, rotting stench, essentially. So I think, like Mary said, the gloom thing, when Walpole uses that, it's all the senses. And I think the smell here really stands out, as well as the visual and the sort of the feel inside it. Rotting lilies smell disgusting, so I think it would be really, really unpleasant in there.
And we've just gone on about, or I at least went on about, how these cemeteries is this place where people like to enjoy to go to, and Stoker's reminding us by going to a tomb that no, this is a center of death that we're visiting, and pulls out all the stops to describe it. And then we get some very kind of realistic description of what it would be like to open it. There's there's a casing of lead beneath it, and he has to go through this whole process of sawing through the screws and getting it all open. It's sealed. I mean, tombs have to be, especially above ground. Coffins have to be sealed in the 19th century. Now they're all sealed. I mean, they should be sealed underground, especially. But and then Seward though has this line here. It seemed to be as much an affront. Opening it up, it seemed to be as much an affront to the dead as it would have been to have stripped off her clothing in her sleep whilst living. So Stewart's still in this mindset that there's some kind of sexual violation going on with Lucy. That's what this whole situation is about for him. And then, sorry, I need to pour a little, finish the drink here. There should be a break where I just fix another drink, but I haven't been able to come up with that yet. But they open it up and the coffin was empty, that she is not there. And I love Seward's response that I am satisfied that Lucy's body is not in the coffin, but that only proves one thing. What is that? That it is not there. That he can't go there. He can't fathom a supernatural response to what is going on. And and it's just empty, and logically you need to figure out what's going on is all Seward's going to do. Perhaps a body snatcher, he says. So
and that's exactly the empty tomb image. Stoker is almost subverting that, and what Thomas and what anyone thinking about and processing the empty tomb would think about is that, oh, someone must have moved the body, whether it's body snatchers or something like that, or maybe we've got the wrong tomb, or maybe there's been a mix-up, or these kind of logical rational explanations. You try and explain it away, and yeah, like Seward is absolutely right. All that it proves is that there is an empty tomb. It doesn't prove anything else. But what the leap of faith or that kind of thing in both of the empty tomb scenarios is that it's tied to death. Jesus's resurrection is about a victory over death, and here it's subverting that, and the undeath of vampires is a different kind of, not victory, but subversion of that power of death.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get into undead and what that's all about in a little bit. But in the meantime, that they're just then Van Helsing's job is like, we're just going to spend some time watching, and it was a lonely vigil. That was going to be my drink. I actually had another drink design, and it was the Lonely Vigil, and it was brandy and that honey whiskey with no ice, but that I'll drink later. So for my Lonely Vigil late tonight. It is, but they're watching, and then Lauren, you want to read this little paragraph for Suddenly as I Turned Around?
Mm-hmm. Suddenly as I turned around, I thought I saw something like a white streak moving between two dark yew trees at the side of the churchyard, farthest from the tomb. At the same time, a dark mass moved from the professor's side of the ground and hurriedly went towards it. Then I too moved, but had to go round headstones and railed off tombs, and I stumbled over graves. The sky was overcast, and somewhere far off an early cock crew. A little way off, beyond a line of scattered juniper trees, which marked the pathway to the church, a white, dim figure flitted in the direction of the tomb. The tomb itself was hidden by trees, and I could not see where the figure disappeared. I heard the rustle of actual movement where I had first seen the white figure, and coming over, found the professor holding in his arms a tiny child. When he saw me, he held it out to me and said, "Are you satisfied now?"
And so it's just, no, I said, in a way that I felt was aggressive. So I'm still not buying this. But there she is, the woman in white, appearing again, in Hampstead. Not necessarily on the Heath, but, that imagery is still so powerful for, I keep mentioning Women in White for the audience. It's not just a popular book through that, last half of the 19th century. It is the imagery of it. It's stage play. You see tons of images about that meeting of this woman in white, and it's such a popular it's such an element of popular culture for that last half of
very much the first mystery novel.
Yeah.
So it sparks this whole and the way that this text is told very much emulates the mystery novel. And the Woman in White wasn't
narratives,
the Woman in White wasn't just, the beginning of a genre that would spawn things like Sherlock Holmes. It was, you had these wonderful Art Nouveau, like huge floor to ceiling theatre advertisements. You had people naming their cats after Fosco. You had all of this, really fandom culture, and it had adaptations, and it was on stage, and it was emulated in art and advertisement. So it was very much a massive cultural touchstone. And certainly all through these scenes with Lucy and Hampstead, a very, very definite kind of callback to what Collins is doing. It's easy to kind of undersell the importance of the Woman in White in some ways, because we take so much of it now for granted. But the point where it's published and the response that novel had really was groundbreaking, and things like Dracula probably wouldn't have the afterlife that they have if it hadn't have been for Collins and the way that novel was received. It was really, fundamentally changed the way that literature was read and enjoyed, and continued on after the novel itself.
Because you have other authors and novels that are very popular, and there's even merchandise about them, that kind of thing. But this is in that thriller category, and that is almost creative. This in a sense by Collins, what we come to think of as the thriller. All the pieces are in place for that one, and it's more than just a popular book. This is a big piece of popular culture in the 19th century, the late 19th century. So, but they get to her, and the child is there, and they look at the child's throat, and it was without a scratch or scar of any kind. So we were just in time, said the professor. So the professor's not that interested in saving the children from being bitten by the bloofer lady. It's like, it's very much the same approach that Seward takes in his Asylum. So I will let you practice your insanity and then try to do something about it afterwards, not try to prevent anybody else from being victimized. So, and I love their solution here. Like, they found the child and they can't take it to a police station because then they have to answer questions. So they wait for a cop to come along and just like put the child out there for the cop to see, so he'll take care of it. It's very nice. It's also a reminder of that these are Victorian gentlemen playing by different rules. They know that we don't have to follow the law as long as we're following our own kind of righteous code of ethics that we believe in, that we believe are true to our religion and culture, that we're doing good. So they do that. And then they get a cab near the Spaniards, which Stoker doesn't have to mention, because he doesn't mention that they go in there, but he mentions it. And it's another just like, let's throw another pub in the area that does still exist. Have you been to the Spaniards, Mary, or anybody?
I know it's on the west side of Hampstead Heath.
I'm not as familiar with North London as the East End of London.
I have a picture of Spaniards too, so which is still there and still in existence. Here it is in a picture from earlier. It says Spaniards up here, then Charrington and Company Ales here, but this is what it looks like, and it's still there. And they even have a website now you can visit. I think they're open now, even in the pandemic. They have reopened and they're doing business. But
we really love our ancient pubs in England.
yes, another reason why I need to go.
Well, in Nottingham, we have what purports to be the oldest pub in the country. So if anyone's ever going on an old pub tour of the UK, you need to go to Nottingham, because that's our claim to fame, is the oldest pub in the UK.
one day I'll get there. But I almost feel like too, the fact that Stoker has to mention this, it's almost like we're on this kind of bar crawl map of Hampstead that like, I'm going to show you all the places where you can go and drink. So because none of it matters. He doesn't have to mention Spaniards.
It also physically places it. You know, a lot of Gothic plays very fast and loose with physical locations. You know, you read a lot of 18th and early 19th century Gothic and you think, there's no chance that this is real. Though Mary Shelley researches very, very carefully and makes sure that everything's correct. But there's something about the added horror of, well, I've been to the Spaniards and I know where that pub is and I know the street that they're walking down. That could be the same street I'm walking down. I think it's the start of that, you know, late 19th century, you get a lot of that urban Gothic where it's like, well, it could be round the corner from you. You know this street, you know the area. It's not a fantastical location. It's not an imagined town. It's not, you know, it's not like Austin does when it's like, well, I'll make up a town in Hampshire.
Or reading novels in the 18th or 19th century where they put the dash there instead of actually naming a place.
The company of Shire.
And now it is, oh, no, I'm going to situate you in the place. And for this novel especially, it really helps. I've talked about this before, how Stoker, by setting this novel in a real place for his readers, the creep factor, you know, really ratchets up, because this is a real life place for us, and something supernatural is going on here. And maybe this is something we can thank Wilkie Collins for, I wonder. So in doing this in novels, like saying, this is a real place and I'm going to put scenes here that you understand. No, I mean, Dickens does it absolutely all throughout, you know, his career. So, but in this kind of thriller category or, you know, Gothic category, it's really important. I
mean, Mary Shelley does it, particularly in texts like Valperga. She went and she researched very, very carefully, but they're not familiar locations. What she's doing is painting a very accurate picture for somewhere you're unlikely to have been to. Whereas what Collins and Dickens and the late 19th century authors start to do is make it somewhere you probably have been to and somewhere you probably do know. And that takes on a different type of creep. And I think you're moving towards that more sinister sort of, the reality of, this isn't 300 years ago in Catholic France or, you know, ancient Italy. This is right now in the very same London that you know and that you have walked through. That takes on a very different chill factor, because it's real. It becomes so much more real. You know, you've been in that place. He does it a lot.
I mean, Whitby. Think of the way he uses Whitby, you know, to really situate it, and think of how strong that is for readers now. I mean, you know, you've been to Whitby and you've done those, you know, wonderful things there. That the place becomes so connected with it. Now, he certainly doesn't know that that's going to happen, but that is what happens for readers. Readers really like to go visit these places. And
well, this is why Mary loves this novel so much, because it's really closely connected to where you're from in Essex, right, Mary?
So basically I always get really annoyed when people talk about Purfleet being in London, because Purfleet isn't in London. It's specifically in Essex, and I live in a town called Grays, which is right next door to Purfleet. And I think for me, it's really important that Purfleet is mentioned in the text, partly because of trains. So, you know, Grays, Purfleet, it's about now half an hour, 40 minutes to get into London, into Fenchurch, and there's a direct line. And I think this would have been the line in the 19th century, going from Fenchurch to Southend-on-Sea, which is right at the coast, so city to coast. And right in the middle, you have Purfleet, which is about half an hour on the train on a direct line out of London. And a lot of people in London would go to Purfleet for day trips. So there's a local Essex historian, Jonathan Catton, who did a lot of really great work on this part of Essex and its connection to Dracula. So obviously, Purfleet, you have Carfax House and the insane asylum. There is a Carfax House in Essex, in Purfleet, but it was built in 1900. But what you have, I think in 1891, you have Purfleet House, which was built by one of the Whitbreads, who's of brewing fame, I think. I'm not really that into beer, so forgive me. But he basically built this house called Purfleet House, and it had a chapel attached to it. And you could go to Purfleet on the train, get off and pay the gardener and go and have a look around the grounds for a nice day out. It was also on the Thames estuary, so you've got all of the nice kind of chalk quarry in Essex, and then you could go look at the Thames, look across to Kent, or also look back to London. So you've got all these nice views, nice kind of scenery around that. And then next to, like quite close to Purfleet House, you have Ordnance House, which would have been a kind of military storage place that I think was used in the French, in the kind of the war with France and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of really interesting military history in this area, because it's in that kind of place on the Thames. It's really easy to get to. Most of these buildings aren't there anymore. They were destroyed and rebuilt. Purfleet House isn't there anymore. There is a church called St. Stephen's, which was built from the same brick. And I think there's a little heritage plaque that says, you know, this has a connection to Dracula. Ordnance House also isn't there, but the magazines, so the kind of the big storage places, one of them is still there. And magazine number 5, there's a really cool local history centre, heritage centre. It's got a load of really interesting military stuff. And I just remember when I went there one time and, you know, looking around at all this cool, like World War I, World War II stuff. And then I go around a corner and there's a coffin and all this Dracula stuff. Because Ordnance House, I think this is Jonathan Catton's theory. Ordnance House would have been Seward's mental asylum. They're quite close to each other. So you have Purfleet House and Ordnance House, but you can't see them when you're on the grounds. And they're kind of divided by a wall that if you went up to, you could have seen the other one, but not from like actually on the grounds, which I think it just really mirrors that setup in Dracula. So I think that, you know, Jonathan Catton, I think it's a good theory, and I wouldn't be surprised if Stoker went on a day trip or something to Purfleet and looked around and saw these buildings and thought, oh, you know,
I'm so happy to have you guys on the show to give people this kind of, you know, history about that area too, or these locations. That's so wonderful. Jennifer mentioned in the chat that she said, Mary, you live in Graves. That is the most Gothic thing ever. So yeah. So it's Greys. Think of the color grey, which, you know, I think is quite apt. Yeah, so no, Graves would have been cool, yes. But unfortunately, alas, no.
If only.
Yes, if only. So
maybe we should move to somewhere with a more Gothic name.
Yeah, no, Graves is perfect because we all think you're saying Graves anyway. So
cool, that works.
It was let's get back to the text because man, I always blow over with you guys. Last time you were on, it was like 40 minutes over for this show. So but it was 2 o'clock. So next day, it was 2 o'clock before we found a suitable opportunity for our attempt meaning to go back to the tomb. It was because it was a funeral at the time. And I love this extra, detail too, that like they go back to the cemetery and there's a funeral going on. Of course there is. And the last stragglers of the mourners had taken themselves lazily away. And Seward also realized distinctly the perils of the law, which we were incurring in our unhallowed work, that they are like, grave robbers. They are like body snatchers going in here to do this work. And they go in, and this time they open the coffin, and there lay Lucy, seemingly just as we had seen her the night before her funeral. She was, if possible, more radiantly beautiful than ever, and I could not believe that she was dead. The lips were red, nay, redder than before, and the cheeks were a delicate, and on the cheeks was a delicate bloom. Is this a juggle? I said to him. And, the first remodeler, the juggle means, a kind of, to entertain with jest or tricks or something like that. Is this a trick? So juggle is still being used in the 19th century as not just juggling, but it is, as has become now, but as just a in its original sense as a trick. There's Lucy in her tomb, and her beauty is not only there, but she's more radiantly beautiful than ever. Tammy had a question in the Q&A. Is Stoker playing with the Madonna whore archetype with Lucy? She's voluptuous and seductive as she's turning in a vampire, but beautiful and sweet otherwise. I wanted to mention that question just because that's where I want to go a little bit with this discussion about Lucy's appearance. And there's more, because then let's just go more of how she looks here. When Van Helsing goes up, he kind of as he spoke, he put over his hand, and in a way that made me shudder, pulled back the dead lips and showed the white teeth. And he says they're even sharper than before. He touched one of the canine teeth and that below it. The little children can be bitten. So there's two things going on here. I think it's, number one, the beauty of her, which is so unreal. We hit on this in the last chapter as well, that and it's from the Byron quote, the decays effacing fingers have not taken over this body yet, that she is even more beautiful. And that is, it seems, especially for these men, horrifying that she would still remain to be beautiful. But also, I love how this kind of touches on vampire folklore, and how the proof that people would they would dig up bodies, and the proof that they were a vampire is the kind of ways that they were, the signs they were looking for were like, there's a kind of bloom in the cheeks, and the lips are red, and they look like they're alive, and they look like they've just fed maybe on someone. And it turns out these are the actual signs of decomposition, that, the bloating from the gases makes the body, and there can be a bloom in the cheeks, and with the teeth getting longer, your lips and your gums will shrink after death. So your teeth can appear longer. Something I always have to dispel with students is that it is not true that your teeth and hair continue to grow after death. That is still an urban myth that people believe in. That is not true. You're dead. Cells have stopped in of being alive in your body. So your hair doesn't grow, your teeth don't grow longer. But it can appear that way if things are shrinking, and so. But in this case, none of that is true, because she is becoming a vampire and her teeth are getting longer. And do you guys want to touch on the beauty of her a bit before I move into the teeth?
Yeah. Do you want to start, Mary?
I mean, yeah. I think that comment, Madonna whore, that's a really great way to look at this. One way that I always like to read Lucy is also through Lilith. So Lilith is kind of a figure in Jewish apocrypha, taken from Isaiah. And one of the translations of Lilith is also Lamia, which I think you talked about when you talked about the kind of Greek vampire tradition. It comes from this kind of Babylonian way, but Lilith is kind of developed in Jewish apocrypha as a figure who is associated both with lust but also with killing children. So if you go back to stuff like the alphabet of Ben Sirah, he has this story about Lilith being Adam's first wife, and not wanting to submit to Adam, and so then she then leaves, and that's why Eve's created. And various different traditions of her where she's cursed. Sometimes she's considered as a demon. Sometimes she's considered as the mother of vampires. She's often barren and wants children. That's why she's associated with, children and young children. And I think especially because Eve is the mother of humans, Lilith is then the kind of the alternate mother of demons or mother of vampires. And interestingly, I think in some of the kind of Jewish apocrypha stuff, you get some like apotropaics with her. So there's some kind of
apotropaics or preventative measures.
Yes, warding against her to keep her out. So there's some kind of rites, exorcism rites to make sure that she's kept away from houses, and specifically children are vulnerable. Children, boys up to the age of 8 days, because that's when they would be circumcised, and women up to the age of 20 days. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but yeah, children are particularly vulnerable from her, but she's often described as both erotic and sensual to men, but also associated with this kind of child killing or that kind of need to have children. So I think I always like to read Lucy in that way, as that kind of vampiric figure, where she is incredibly beautiful, and all of these men do lust after her, but her victims, it's not like Dracula, she's Dracula's victim, but who's her victims? It's children. And I think
they also really jump to the men in this novel really jump to the kind of sexualizing this whole process too. That it's not just that she has been attacked by a vampire, is becoming a vampire, that they seem to that this needs to be a whole thing associated with her sexuality, right?
Yeah, and that's definitely something, people talk about Madonna and the whore, but I think definitely Eve, Lilith, you get that. And I think if you read Mina and Lucy in this way, Mina is the Eve figure who the men want to protect, because she's perfect. But Lucy, almost her lusting after 3 men is her transgressing before she's even become a vampire. It's almost inherent in her.
Yeah. And Seward keeps hinting at this the whole time, that's what's going on here. So
yeah, she's almost entirely constructed through men as a kind of erotic object, and that's exactly what you get with Lilith. And I think with both you get this obsession with their hair. So I think I can't remember if you get that here, but definitely when she
next chapter
died. Oh yeah. But,
well, there's a lot about her hair and the crown of her hair.
That's also something that you get with Lilith. So I think that kind of dichotomy, definitely.
When you guys wanted to switch, because Josh was supposed to be today, but he needed today off to celebrate his anniversary with his partner. So happy anniversary, Josh.
Happy anniversary.
Because I was really hoping you were going to be on next week. So, because that's when we'll really get Lucy, because we get her awake, as a vampire and dealing with that. And this is my attempt to move things along, because yes, everything you said I love, but also there's a whole other sense too, and this is all to do with vampires, and that when Van Helsing and is examining her, he's looking at her and examining her teeth, and then he has this curious thing, and this is really hard to kind of configure with now what we think of vampires, because He says, there's one thing which is different from all recorded here, Here is some dual life that is not as the common. She was bitten by the vampire when she was in a trance, sleepwalking. And then he goes on this explanation of what he's talking about. In trance, could he best come to take more blood? Dracula come take more blood. In trance, she died. And in trance, she is undead too. So it is that she differ from all other, meaning all other vampires. Usually when the undead sleep at home, as he spoke, he made a comprehensive sweep of his arm to designate what to a vampire was home, the tomb. Their face show what they are. But this so sweet that was when she not undead, she go back to the nothings of the common dead. There is no malign here. And so it make hard that I must kill her in her sleep. You know, he's always throwing out those little, so then I have to cut off her head. Van Helsing's telling it Lucy's a different kind of vampire than it seems what Van Helsing has investigated before or what he knows about vampires. And that it is because that she was bitten while sleepwalking. And this, it seems to make some sense to Van Helsing that she is more, that the fact that she's more beautiful than the usual vampire is because there's no malign in her expression, that's all tied to the fact that she was in a trance. And so Van Helsing seems to differentiate for when a vampire is undead, when they're sleeping, and that they're not usually good looking as she is. And it's really odd, and it's something that kind of doesn't make it into the vampire, you know, kind of folklore after this. But I also want to point out that undead, he keeps saying undead, and I'll say it later too. Van Helsing uses the word undead, or the hyphenated word undead, 15 times in this chapter. And for the whole book, it's 37 times we get the word undead. So it's almost half of the mentions of the word undead are just in this chapter. Now, part of that is because he has to, you know, he's defining what this vampire is. So he keeps talking about undead in here. But it's, there's also this kind of whole, well, we'll get to that in a second. But what I wanted to finish out with was, while some of Stoker's kind of aspects of vampirism, like this whole thing of like when you were bitten, like it wasn't in a trance or not, that doesn't kind of make it into popular vampire folklore now. But the very fact that kind of Stoker is attempting a kind of taxonomy of vampires here is so important, that he's really going out of his way to try to define for his audience what vampires are like. And in this, what specifically Lucy is like. That it's really important vampire texts, because vampire texts before this don't ever go into this kind of detail, right? Or do they?
No, and this is kind of, obviously you have on the parallel to this, The Blood of the Vampire by Marriott, which does imply that there are multiple types of vampirism. Because
same year that book was released, yeah.
Yeah, because she's a psychic vampire. But when you've got things, you know, you start out with things like folklore and you go into things like stag, which is the vampire is a horrific monster. They look horrible, they look inhuman. Then you move into the Polydorian vampire, who is, you know, unsettlingly beautiful but ugly at the same time. You get that again with Carmilla, and that kind of leads into Dracula. But what is really interesting is that the way that modern texts deal with this concept, and even things like Vampire the Masquerade. In Vampire the Masquerade, you have, the way that it works as an RPG is you need different types of class. So, you know, rather than the traditional D&D elf, human, dwarf, genasi, Asmar, whatever you might be, you have different types of vampire, and they're based on different literary vampires. So they're drawing from different folklores, or different, you know, some of them are the Nosferatu style vampire, and some of them are the Lost Boys style vampire, and some of them are a psychic vampire. But what you do kind of get here is this concept that vampirism is not one singular homogenous thing. And I think this concept of kind of there are multitudes within and there are possibilities within actually makes this very, very unsettling and very strange, that you have this very beautiful Lucy who sleeping is you know, kind of like a sculpture. I think I mentioned the Anatomical Venuses before, which our colleague Hannah Moss has done a lot of work on. These wax figures that were used for medical teaching, that were beautiful, you know, kind of pre-Raphaelite style, but then you took the top off and you have all the organs inside. So, you know, they are horrible and they are dead but not dead, and you have that here with Lucy. She's dead but not dead. But I think what's really fascinating is that I don't think anyone's ever really stopped and thought, oh yeah, what Stoker's implying here is that there is more than one type of vampire and more than one possibilities for vampire. But what modern interpretations of vampires have done is allow for the possibility. I mean, even when you get things like Twilight, in Twilight, vampires have multiple different powers. You know, it's not something Mayer invents, and she doesn't do it particularly well. But the concept in Twilight is that when you become a vampire, something is, you know, the process is magical, something is awoken in you, and when you become a vampire, you have some sort of magical power. And that's kind of what's being implied here, is that depending on the way that you're made, depending on the circumstances of you being bitten and things like that, there are these multiple possibilities. And I think this is something that maybe is underdeveloped here, but really gets picked up on and run with very heavily, particularly in 21st century Gothic.
It does, and not to cut you short, but we're like halfway down this chapter, and I want to know, because there's some other more important, there's some I think more important things here coming up when he talks about Lucy, in that he says that, well, first of all, he has to destroy her, but then he has this thing, she have yet no life taken, though that is of time, and to act now would be to take danger from her forever. And then, you know, we have to get Arthur, and then, you know, to do that. But this idea that Lucy is unnatural and must be destroyed, but also that she has, well, here's, and before we begin, because it's so easy to begin, you know, allying, you know, Lucy so much, becoming an ally, because she's a victim twice. She's a victim by Dracula. She's a victim by the vampire slayers. I think we should also remember too, especially for the characters in this book, that she is a vampire. She's a monster preying on small children in the area, and especially if you believe in the kind of Christian view of life that these characters ascribe to, she can't go to heaven as the undead. That perhaps she's damned to hell, but perhaps her soul is in some kind of purgatory here because of Van Helsing, because until she's destroyed, that, you know, if she was evil when she was alive, she would go right to hell, but, you know, but because she was good, she's going to go to heaven when they destroy her. Or even though she's been turned into a vampire against her will, the question is, does she still bear some responsibility, especially in the world of this novel, for the crimes that she commits while undead? And that seems to be what Van Helsing is hinting at, that because she hasn't killed anybody, we can still save her. But that means if she kills someone, what's going to happen to her soul after that? And this is where I want to show a page of the notes that we have from this, from Stoker's notes, and that this is one of his early casts of, no, this is one of the moments where he's listing again for himself vampire powers, and it goes, you know, it goes through fog by instinct, at zoo, rage of lion and eagle, crosses water at exact flood or slack of tide, blah blah blah, all that stuff. The interesting things of this are have to do with death, and that the one here is the absolute despisal of death and the dead, which is weird, and he doesn't really play this up in the novel, but this can tell if dead. Each sees man seemingly dead and says no. That Dracula can tell if someone's dead or not, because they can't then. They don't kind of have that power. They don't have technology. If your heart rate is really faint, they can't quite tell if you're. This is the whole problem of being buried alive then. But below here, he has this weird word here, which Stoker seems to have invented, and it is immortaliable. And then he writes Gladstone next to it. And that's where I want to throw this focus on, this immortaliable, this weird word that he's using to describe immortality. And he links it with William Gladstone, one of the prime ministers of England. And the Gladstone was one of the believers in a thing called conditional immortality. This is all my rabbit hole last night. My kids called up on the intercom and they just said, "Hey Dad, we're all having a late night sandwich, this like barbecue beef brisket." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm busy right now." And I kept working. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm going in a rabbit hole about conditional immortality. And I was denying going to spend time with my kids to eat a barbecue brisket sandwich. And I realized I had gone too far. So I stopped and had a sandwich and then came back to it. But this idea of conditional immortality that people have believed through the centuries, various people have believed this through the centuries. And in the 19th century, there were several people who were writing about it and talking about it then, that immortality is dependent upon accepting Christ. Like, immortality is your salvation, literally. You get immortal life because you accept Christ, and that is your salvation. So salvation is immortal life with God. And if you don't accept Christ, or maybe even don't even know about Christ, then you will eventually go through annihilation. But what this also means is that hell is not forever, like heaven is forever. Only God is forever, right? So Gladstone believes in conditional immortality. He even writes about it. Stoker knows Gladstone. He knows a lot of, big people, famous people, because of his position at the Lyceum. He's friends with Gladstone. And when Dracula is published, he sends a copy to Gladstone. And there's a letter that he writes about, that he sends along with it. It's a story of a vampire, the old medieval vampire, but recrudescent today, and it's full of horrors and terrors, blah, blah, blah. And then he says in the letter, I think pretty well all the vampire legend as to limitations, and these may in some way interest you, who have made as bold a guess at, and the word here is immortaliability. So it's the ability to be immortal, and that's what it is in his note here in the text. So a long-winded way. I'm sorry. This was a rabbit hole, and I had to work through it all because I don't really know about this stuff too much. But if Stoker believes this, or at least is throwing this in the novel as a way of approaching vampires, as he knows Gladstone believes in it, is that there's two kinds of immortality, in a sense, in the novel that he talks about. There's a physical immortality, which vampires have, in which they do not, die, naturally age and die. But there's also a spiritual immortality that being a vampire will prevent you from having, because if you kill somebody, you do not get to be immortal with God in the end after your final death. So conditional immortality, have you come across this? Has this been anything you've worked at, or immortaliability as Stoker phrases it?
I think yes, for both of us. In terms of the text that we would look at, it's not called that. I would say that you get this a lot in the Faustian pact narrative. And you get the kind of So both Marlowe and Goethe's Faust, this idea of immortality being a fallacy, that immortality in terms of the physical immortality is not actually immortality, because it will end and can end. Either that you could die, either that, you know, there's a bargain, be what it may. So you get this kind of the literally dragged to hell Faustian narrative. So you know, the price for this ill-gotten immortality, you know, the end of the monk, it's slightly different here because he's not promised immortality, but at the end of the monk you have the titular monk Ambrosio being dragged by demons, and
you get that idea in Melmoth the Wanderer,
yes,
as well,
I was just
who is connected to that idea of the Faustian pact, and Melmoth is associated with a kind of 150-year span where he has to find someone else to trade places with him, as it were, or he will be dragged to hell.
Saint Irvine and Saint Leon do similar things, don't they?
So there's also so you have the Faustian pact kind of immortality that's linked to kind of damnation, and a literal pact with the devil, but you also have the tradition of alchemy, and that's more of what you get in St. Leon. So St. Leon is a 1799 novel published by William Godwin, who is Mary Shelley's father. And it's in a tradition of alchemy that's more kind of scientific, and it dates back hundreds of years. You can find stories about Nicholas Flamel, who has been connected with alchemy. He has been connected with alchemy longer than you know, the Harry Potter associations. But you had, you know,
I didn't know Nicholas Flamel was a historical figure.
Oh, absolutely. And he apparently found this text, I think by, I can't remember. It was originally a Jewish text, and I think associated with a rabbi called Moses de Leon, which I think is connected 100% to St. Leon, the naming of that text. But yeah, this idea of a kind of Kabbalistic way that you could you could educate yourself and find out a way to become immortal, but it was a process, and you had to keep doing it. And you have all of these theories about longevity, and that some of them are tied to injecting blood, some of them are tied to breath. So there was, I think, a satirical text, I forget its name, but this idea where you would have young people breathe on you, and you would take in their breath, and that would help you to become immortal. But it was a kind of limited immortality. So with alchemy, you had to keep doing the kind of the potions or that kind of scientific thing. You had to keep doing this, or you would die. With longevity, you had to keep doing whatever it was, whether it's breath or blood or anything, to keep doing that. And the same with the traditions of Kabbalah. You know, it's a practice. You would devote your life to doing that if you wanted it to do that. And then you also have, especially in the 19th century, kind of Rosicrucian traditions, which are kind of secret sects that are also tied to alchemy, but also, you know, secret knowledge that you could prolong your life. But yeah, the idea that it is very much in the physical, material world, as opposed to the spiritual immortality that you find in religion.
And like Mary said, there's this constant thing of cost and price. You can't. The thing about physical immortality is that it's not true immortality. So whereas spiritual immortality is God-given and therefore true immortality because it's a blessed immortality, physical immortality is, you know, you are consuming. You either need other people or material things, and this goes back to a lot of kind of even things like Celtic and Welsh folklore. So when you have things like Merlin and Nimue, and, you know, this idea of beings that lived for a very long time, there's always, or magic or anything that sustains kind of supernaturally, it must be fed by cost. There's no sort of you put in, you get. It's always you have to pay the price, which of course spiritual immortality has, but you've still got this idea of providence, even by the late 19th century, that to achieve spiritual immortality, you just walk the path that God has set out for you. You don't actually have to make sacrifices. You don't have to, it's not a high cost, because you just walk the path God intended for you. And if you walk the path that God intended for you, then you will achieve spiritual immortality, because you're always letting God guide you. And by letting God guide you, your reward is the afterlife in heaven. Whereas if you stray from that path and you seek alternative means, then you will eventually be damned. And you get this in anything like Frankenstein, any of these Faustian narratives, that there's always an element of playing God, that it's that subversion, and the material cost is always too high. It's insustainable. It will never actually lead to true immortality, because it's impossible to actually sustain it, because you are not divine, you are not a deity, and therefore, be it 150 years like Melmoth or 950 years, eventually it's going to come to an end, and you are not actually as powerful as you would be had you walked.
I'll take the 950. I mean, if I could get 950, I'd be happy with that. But to bring this to vampires, then Van Helsing really is kind of creating this system here whereby Lucy will not get this spiritual immortality if she takes the life of someone, and that's the impetus. We have to save her now, but it also makes her it's not her fault. Like, she has been turned into this against her will, and it is this kind of responsibility issue with vampires, in that which Stoker sets up here, and I think it's strong in this novel, and it continues whether or not you wanted to for creators a vampire thing since then, that it is, but in their world, it is all the more dangerous because she could be damned forever, even though she's a victim of a vampire.
And this idea of female death is really complicated by this, because traditionally suicide and female death has this kind of exceptional status, that when purity is threatened, when innocence is threatened, when your path of providence is threatened. Oh, my cat's stuck on the wardrobe. Sorry if you can hear me.
You need to get the cat, you can, if you want.
It's fine. She'll be fine for, another 15 minutes. It's her fault for getting up there. She's the size of, she's like this big. But this idea of female death, that the Clarissa figure, it goes right back to Shakespeare, to Greek myth, to tragedy. You have this ability as a woman to allow yourself to die. And by dying, you are permitted to pass into the arms of God, because you are sacrificing your material concerns for your immortal afterlife. So it's this weird thing, technically suicide is a sin. It's a sin to take your own life. It's a sin to actively seek death. But what's kind of happening here is Lucy's death endangers her immortal spirit and her immortal soul far more than her life does. And this is, I think, for a 19th century reader, this would be a real point of horror. Because there's this idea that, you get this kind of like in Jane Eyre, when you have the Helen character who's like, yeah, I'm going to die of TB. I don't mind, because I know I go to the arms of God when I die, and I live without pain and suffering. Lucy's death being the thing that could transport her to sin and deny her that immortality is horrifying, because she can't, there's no way out for her. There's no way for her to prevent that. And it really, you get in a lot of Gothic novels female death. At the end of Shelley's Valperga, both of the women die. You get a lot of, noble suicide or women allowing themselves to die because they are like, well, I'm at risk, or I've been, my innocence and my purity has been threatened, so the best thing to do is transform myself to God. And Lucy's ability to seek that and to get that is completely removed from her. And I think that, particularly for a reader at the end of the 19th century, would be absolutely horrifying, because death is supposed to be that final step in the journey to be closer to God as a mortal. And the fact that actually in death she could completely lose that ability, it's absolutely horrifying as a reader. So I think that adds a real tension here that perhaps we've lost a little bit as 21st century readers. And I think if you look back through all of these scenes where she's dying and the way they look at her when she's dying, that kind of like, well, she's dying, so at least, yes, she's dying, it's horrible for us, but she's going to go to heaven and everything will be fine. And then it's like, no, she's a vampire, she's potentially going to kill small children, one of the most terrible sins you could commit. She maybe isn't even conscious that she's doing it. Oh my God, this is horrifying. Yeah. It's a real, like, spine-chilling, blood-curdling moment, I think, as a reader.
Okay, good. Let's roll through the rest of this chapter, because we're we'll be. I don't want to be as over time as I was last time you were on, so, which I love, but but so they have to take care of her. Oh, we're gonna get to see the cat, maybe. Anastasia asks in the chat here if we can see the cat. So look at this. This is the way the cat gets down. The cat jumps on there. Whoa, we get cat trick. Sundays with Dracula, cat tricks. So I love that. So, all right. My cat made an appearance on the last show, so I needed to get out of the room, and you could see her back here scratching at the door, and I had to let her out. So, great. Thank you for that.
Yeah, a little excitement for everybody.
Yeah.
Is my tiny semi-feral cat. And her acrobatics.
Yes, that is lots of Drac cats, as Lee says in the
cat's name is Poppy, but
Poppy.
we affectionately call her Daria, because if anyone was a fan of the 90s cartoon Daria, she has the same sullen face.
There you go. All righty. Back to Dracula, not Drac cats, but Dracula. They're worried about telling Arthur that Arthur has to be okay with this. And Van Helsing says, I need Arthur to face this, that even if this is going to kind of really, traumatize Arthur, knowing this is going on, he wants him to face this. And then we get this note left by Van Helsing, which is not delivered. It is like, it's one of these in case I die notes that you will, do this stuff. And then it's kind of instructions and what's going on here in case he doesn't make it through. Maybe Dracula will show up while I'm waiting at the tomb. And I'm not worried about this like young girl vampire, but I am worried if Dracula shows up. Maybe he'll even have his wolf, and I'm not going to survive this. None of it matters. And then we get this short entry from Seward's diary in which, he's like, maybe Van Helsing's insane and all of this. And I have to do all that, which I love, because it's this kind of, alternate, and other authors have done this and kind of, this is a kind of alternate, storyline that Dracula is actually a text just concocted by madmen. And, the real story is like the Dracula tapes by Fred Saberhagen, where Dracula says, no, let me tell you the real story of what actually happened. But they meet with Arthur and Quincy. Quincy's mentioned earlier, that so fine young man of America that gave his blood, by Van Helsing. Nobody can mention Quincy without also giving him some kind of modifier that he's a fine young man, that like Quincy love is so strong amongst these men. Everybody loves Quincy. Everybody loves Lucy. Everybody loves Quincy. Everybody will love Mina then later. So they meet with them, and Quincy only responds laconically. So I guess he's a real American in that. Very terse, few words. This is the way Quincy will talk. And Van Helsing proposes that, we have to, first of all, he asks for a promise, and and he says, promise you won't get mad, which I think is really funny that he has to go through. And they all say, okay, we won't. We're all gentlemen here. We understand. We're all honorable, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, like, oh, I'm going to cut off her head. And Arthur freaks out, of course. He freaks out. And Van Helsing has to not convince him that Lucy's undead here and needs to be taken care of, but has to just convince them to trust him. And he says, at one point, he says, do not go forth in anger with me, which almost sounds like a scriptural quote, like I'm quoting some saying of Jesus, do not go forth in anger with me. And again, it's just another example of Van Helsing's language and how he's becoming this, or not becoming, he always has been this kind of spiritual, guide for these men, and almost a Messiah, a Messiah-like figure for these men to follow in his ways in battling vampires. There are mysteries which men can only guess at, which age by age they may solve only in part. Believe me, we are now on the verge of one. And then it's, I'm going to cut off her head, which I love the way he throws that out there at the end of talks.
May I cut off the head of Miss Lucy?
So, yes, and he asks very politely, may I cut off the head of dead Miss Lucy? And Arthur, obviously is angry at that, but he's Van Helsing is able to kind of placate him by letting him know that how much he has invested in this too. And that's where he says, do not go forth in anger with me in a long life of acts which were often not pleasant to do. Another great hint at Van Helsing has led this life battling the undead, battling other monsters, maybe, that he's got this kind of monster hunting life, which he's still learning, because he's still learning what these vampires are as I'm trying to battle them here. And this confession appeases Arthur, at least for the time being. And there's a very unsatisfying end to the chapter, right? Oh, it is hard to think of, and I cannot understand, but at least I shall go with you and wait. And like, I like the cliffhanger endings of chapters. I like, so, but that's it. So then they're going to go off he's going to bring Quincy and Arthur with him. And the crew's almost, the Mystery Incorporated team's almost together. We still have to get, Jonathan and Mina in there. But this initial, crew to take care of Lucy is what's going to happen in the next chapter. So at the risk of going on another 15, 20 minutes, is there anything I didn't hit that that you want to mention before we close out this chapter?
No, I think the only thing, and we did talk about this, I just think there's a stark difference between the sleeping dead Lucy and the walking undead Lucy.
We'll see next chapter.
Yeah, and I think you start to get it in this chapter. And I think, I don't think I have more to say right now, but I think for when you guys are reading that chapter over this next week and thinking about it next week, think about that difference between the two and that kind of implied liminal space within Lucy's own body and own person, that there is almost two Lucys inhabiting the same cadaver. There is this, and it makes me think of the vampires in Buffy, that you have, a person with a body that's then inhabited by a demon. There's this kind of, this break between who you were and who you become as a vampire. And I think what Stoker starts to play with here, that idea that the mortal being and the vampiric being, as someone's just said about the double and the doppelganger, it's very much what's happening here, that within one physical entity there is a doubling. And I think, considering that this is a novel that is so interested in insanity and the mind and things like that, that this is a really interesting concept that, you know, it's playing with the idea of mesmerism and the unconscious, that there is possibly two selves and two sides of oneself and two persons that live within one, with one physical being. This is a really, really kind of groundbreaking concept. And I think that tension between the Lucy that they see in the coffin and the Lucy they see outside of the coffin, in terms of construction of monstrousness, amazing. Such a good way to make a monster. But in terms of, you know, Findercircular understanding of psyche and understanding of spirituality, you know, this is really important, and something that I think we're still considering and dealing with as a global society when it comes to things like mind and body.
All right.
But yeah, that'd be the only thing I would want to point out is pay special attention to that difference and that differentiation between the two Lucys.
We will. All right. Well, Dracuphiles, thank you all for tuning in today, or if you're watching this program on replay, thank you for watching it on replay. We'll post this recording on our website. We have a Sundays with Dracula Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. You can look us up on Facebook, join in that conversation. I'm also always available to answer questions via email. Next Sunday's co-host joining me will be horror theater maker Josh Hitchens, and David Skal will be our special guest for Chapter 16. And don't forget to join me tomorrow night for Monday Drac Chat. Remember to register for it ahead of time if you haven't already. Members and Dracula Club people only, and you can only watch it on Zoom as it airs at 6:30 p.m. EDT, and we will not be posting the show after it airs. If you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website and check out all the virtual offerings we have. If you become a member of the Dracula Club, I will be more grateful than the bartenders at the Hampstead pubs when Van Helsing is in town. Mary and Lauren, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having
Thanks
us.
for having us.
It's always a pleasure.
It's totally awesome. I love having you guys here. So join us next week, everyone, on Sundays with Dracula for Chapter 16, when we come face to face with the Bloofer Lady and we learn how many times Stoker can use the word voluptuous in one chapter. I think he's going for the world record for uses of voluptuous in a chapter.
Don't play it as a drinking game.
Yes. Oh, you'd be drunk playing that drinking game in the next chapter.
Poisoning.
So, once again, will be played out by Tucker Christine's pleated gazelle song, Storm into Whitby. Farewell, everyone. And in the words of our friend Dracula, go safely and leave something of the happiness you bring. Bye-bye.